I had lived alone in the old farmhouse at the edge of the oak fence for 3 years. The field stretched quiet behind the house, and the woods pressed close on two sides. My wife had died in the fever season 3 years ago, and since then the rooms had grown too still at night. I kept lanterns burning in the windows and along the fence line every evening. Not because I feared the dark, but because the silence felt heavier when there was no light to push against it. That winter the snow came hard and stayed. For days the wind had howled down from the northern ridges, piling drifts against the barn and turning the road into a white river that swallowed footprints by morning. On the worst night, the storm grew louder still. I sat by the kitchen fire with a cup of tea gone cold, listening to the beams creak and the shutters rattle. The only other sound was the soft hiss of snow against the glass. 3 small knocks broke the noise. They were not the heavy pounding of a traveler or the careless rapping of someone drunk on winter ale. These were light, uncertain, and quick, as if the person knocking could barely lift their hand. I set the cup down and crossed the room. When I opened the door, the wind shoved cold air straight into my face and carried a swirl of snow across the threshold. A child stood on the step. She was small, no more than 6 or 7, wrapped in a coat that hung far too large on her frame. Her skin was a pale green that had gone almost gray from the cold. Snow clung to her dark hair and eyelashes. She wore 1 boot and 1 shoe that did not match, and her hands shook where she clutched the coat closed at her throat. 2 small tusks curved up from her lower jaw, barely visible when she spoke. Her eyes were wide and yellow, the color of winter sunlight on old brass. She looked up at me and whispered, "My mother needs help." The words were thin, almost lost under the wind. I stepped aside without thinking and pulled her into the warmth. She stumbled once on the threshold. I caught her elbow, guided her to the chair nearest the fire, and wrapped the thickest blanket I owned around her shoulders. Her teeth chattered so hard I could hear them. "What is your name?" I asked, keeping my voice low. "Nira," she said. She pulled the blanket tighter. "My mother is in the woods, past the frozen stream. The roof leaks and she will not wake up." I looked past her into the storm. The night was black and white at once, the snow falling in thick sheets that erased the fence line within a few paces. A single lantern would be swallowed before we reached the trees. If I tried to carry only 1 light, we would lose our way coming back. I moved quickly. I took every lantern from the hooks by the door and from the shelf above the mantel. I lit them one by one until the kitchen glowed with 6 separate flames. One I hung outside the front gate so the light would mark the start of the path. Another I tied to the saddle of the old draft horse I kept for hauling. I gave the smallest lantern to Nira and showed her how to hold it steady against her chest. The last 2 I carried myself, 1 in each hand, so the light would fall on the snow ahead of us. I lifted her onto the horse and climbed up behind her. She was light, almost weightless under the blanket. "Hold on to me," I said. "Do not let go." She nodded and gripped the front of my coat with 1 small hand while the other held the lantern. We rode out into the storm. The wind cut across the fields and drove snow into our faces. The lantern swayed and hissed, their light reaching only a few feet before the flakes swallowed it. I kept the horse to the line of the fence as long as I could, then turned toward the dark line of trees. Nira pointed with her free hand when we reached the stream. The water had frozen solid beneath a crust of snow. The horse's hooves cracked through the thinner edges and found purchase on the ice. On the far side, the woods grew thicker. We followed a narrow trail that was little more than a memory under the drifts. After a time, Nira tugged at my sleeve and pointed again. Through the curtain of snow, I saw the shape of a small cabin, its roof sagging on one side, where the thatch had given way. No smoke rose from the chimney. No light showed in the single window. I dismounted and lifted Nira down. She ran ahead through the snow and pushed the door open. I followed with both lanterns. The inside was colder than the storm. The fire had long since died. A woman lay on a narrow bed against the far wall, wrapped in every blanket the cabin possessed. Her skin was the same green as the child's, but drained of color. Her lips had turned dark. Long black hair spilled across the pillow. She breathed, but each breath was shallow and uneven. I set the lanterns on the table and knelt beside the bed. Her pulse was weak but present beneath my fingers. "She is still here," I told Nira. "She has not gone anywhere." The girl stood at my shoulder, lantern light trembling across her face. I could see the fear in her eyes and the small, fierce hope that had brought her through the snow to my door. I built the fire back up with what dry wood remained in the box. The flames caught slowly, then steadied. I wrapped the woman in the thickest blanket I could find and lifted her carefully. She was taller than I had expected, solid even in weakness. Nira helped as much as she could, holding the lantern and pushing the door wider when I carried her mother outside. I laid the woman across the horse's back and tied her gently in place with strips of blanket. Then I lifted Nira up in front of me again. The lantern still burned, marking the way we had come. We turned the horse toward the farm and let the storm close behind us. By the time we reached the fence line, the snow had thickened further, but the lights I had left burning guided us home. I brought the horse into the barn, lifted the woman down, and carried her into the house. Nira walked beside me, still holding her small lantern. I placed the woman on the bed in the spare room at the south end of the house and covered her with every quilt I owned. Her breathing eased a little with the warmth. Nira stood in the doorway watching. Snow melted from her hair and ran in thin lines down her cheeks. I looked at the 2 lanterns still glowing on the table and at the small green face turned up toward mine. Outside, the storm continued to rage, but inside the house, the silence had changed. It was no longer the silence of an empty room. It was the silence of 3 people who had found shelter in the same place. I hung my coat on the hook by the door and added more wood to the kitchen fire. The lanterns I had carried through the snow still flickered. Their light reached across the floor and touched the edge of the blanket where Nira now sat, legs drawn up, eyes heavy with exhaustion and relief. For the first time in 3 years, the house did not feel too large for the night. Morning came slow and gray. The wind had quieted during the night, but snow still fell in soft, steady sheets against the windows. I woke before the light fully reached the room and added wood to the kitchen fire until the flames took hold again. The woman had not stirred when I checked on her earlier. The child slept on the bench near the hearth, curled beneath the blanket I had given her, one small hand still loosely holding the edge of it. I was pouring hot water into the kettle when I heard movement from the south room. A sharp, wet cough broke the quiet, followed by another. Then the sound of someone trying to sit up too quickly. I set the kettle down and crossed the short hallway. She was already half out of the bed when I reached the doorway. The blanket had slipped from her shoulders. One arm was wrapped around the child, pulling her close. Her yellow eyes snapped to me the moment I appeared, wide and sharp with fear. She pulled the girl tighter against her side and spoke in a hoarse voice. "What do you want?" Her words were thick with exhaustion and suspicion. I stayed where I was, one hand resting on the doorframe so I would not seem to be moving toward her. "I want you to live long enough to scold me more politely than that," I said. She did not smile. She studied me the way a cornered animal studies the hunter who has not yet drawn the bow. Her breathing was rough, and I could see the effort it took for her to keep her voice steady. "I have no gold," she said. "I am not asking for gold. I am Orc. I have eyes." She fell silent at that, but the wariness in her face did not ease. She kept one hand on the child's shoulder, as if she expected me to try to take her away. I stepped back into the kitchen without another word and left the door open so she could see what I was doing. I poured the hot water into 3 cups, set out what bread I had, and placed a small bowl of dried berries beside it. Then I returned to the doorway. "You should eat something," I said. "Both of you." She did not move at first. Only after the child stirred and looked up at her did she slowly rise from the bed. She was tall, even weakened as she was. Her steps were careful, as though she expected the floor to betray her. She guided the girl to the table and sat with her back to the wall so she could watch both me and the door. We ate without speaking for a while. The child picked at the bread and berries with small fingers, and the woman ate slowly, watching me between bites. When the food was gone, she spoke again, quieter this time. "Why did you bring us here?" "Because your daughter knocked on my door in the middle of a storm and said her mother needed help." She looked down at the girl, then back at me. Something in her expression shifted, though not enough to be called trust. "My name is Maelra," she said at last. "Maelra Thornshade." I nodded but did not offer my own name yet. It did not seem to matter to her. Over the next days, the storm eased but did not break. Snow still lay deep against the fences and across the fields. Maelra recovered slowly. She coughed often, especially in the mornings, and her breathing remained shallow. She refused to stay in bed once she could stand without swaying. Instead, she moved through the kitchen with quiet purpose, wiping the table, stacking the few dishes, sweeping ash from the hearth. When I told her to rest, she answered without looking at me, "I do not like the feeling of only taking." On the third morning, she found the small bundle of dried herbs I kept above the stove. She crushed a few leaves between her fingers, smelled them, and nodded once as if approving of what she found. Without asking, she began boiling water and steeping the leaves into a dark tea. She set a cup in front of me when it was ready. "It will ease the cough," she said. "For both of us." I drank it. The taste was bitter and clean. By the next morning, her breathing had already grown steadier. The child, Nira, spoke little at first. She stayed close to her mother, but as the days passed, she began to move through the house on her own. She helped carry small sticks of wood from the box by the door and arranged them neatly beside the hearth. She stood on a stool to reach the water bucket and carried it, sloshing only a little to the table. One afternoon, she found the old basket I used for gathering eggs and followed me to the coop without being asked. She did not speak, but she watched carefully as I showed her how to slide a hand beneath a hen and lift the warm eggs out. On the fifth evening, after the lamps were lit, she stood in the kitchen and looked up at the row of lanterns hanging by the door. "Why do you keep so many lights?" she asked. I was mending a strap on an old harness. I paused with the needle in my hand. "So that anyone who is lost can find their way," I said. Nira considered this for a moment. Then she nodded, as if the answer satisfied her. "My mother and I found the right house," she said. Maelra had been stirring the pot over the fire. She stopped at the words but did not turn around. I saw her shoulders tighten, then slowly ease. As Maelra grew stronger, she began to speak more about the life she had left behind. She told me her husband had died 2 winters earlier in a border skirmish between human soldiers and her clan. After his death, the clan had made it clear that a widow with a small child was a burden they could not carry through another hard season. She had taken what little she could and walked south until she found the abandoned cabin near the frozen stream. Human villages would not hire an orc woman for work, not even for the lowest tasks. She had survived by trapping small game and gathering what the forest still offered in winter. When food grew scarce, she had given most of what she found to Nira and gone without herself. The sickness in her chest had come slowly after that. She spoke of these things without asking for pity. She simply laid them out between us like tools on a table, as if she needed me to understand why she had been in that cabin and why she could not afford to trust easily. On the 8th morning, the wind dropped and the snow outside the window looked softer in the pale light. Maelra stood at the door for a long time watching the fields. When she turned back, her face was set. "We should leave soon," she said, "before the roads become passable and people begin to ask questions." I looked past her at the white expanse that still covered everything. "If you leave now, the snow will take you before you reach the next shelter," I said. "You know that." She did not argue, but I could see she wanted to. That night, after Nira had fallen asleep on the bench near the fire, Maelra and I sat across from each other at the table. The only sound was the low crackle of the logs and the occasional sigh of the wind under the eaves. "You have been kind," she said quietly, "but kindness has limits. I will not bring trouble to your door." "You have not brought trouble," I answered. "You have brought 2 people who needed a roof." She studied me across the lamplight. Her yellow eyes were tired but clear. "I will stay only until the snow melts," she said at last. I nodded. I did not trust myself to speak right away. The words were fair. They were exactly what I should have wanted to hear. Yet when she said them, the room felt smaller, as if something had already begun to leave. She rose and went to check on Nira. I remained at the table, listening to the soft sounds of her moving through the house. For the first time in 3 years, I found myself hoping the snow would hold a little longer. The days that followed were quieter than any I had known in a long time. Maelra was still weak, but she refused to remain in bed once she could stand without the room tilting. Each morning, she rose before the light had fully crept across the floor and began moving through the kitchen with a quiet determination that made it clear she would not be idle. She started with small things. She mended a tear in Nira's coat with careful, even stitches, using thread she had found in one of the old drawers. She swept the hearth and stacked the firewood so it would dry better. When she noticed the pot I used for tea had not been properly cleaned in weeks, she scrubbed it without a word. I told her to rest, that she was still recovering. She answered without looking up from the cloth in her hands. I do not like the feeling of only taking. There was no argument in her voice, only a fact. After that, I stopped telling her to sit still. She had knowledge, I did not. On the fourth morning, she crushed a handful of dried roots she had found among my meager supplies and boiled them into a dark, bitter tea. She set a cup in front of me without explanation. "It will help the cough that comes with the cold air," she said. "Yours and mine." I drank it. The taste was sharp and clean, and by the next day the tightness in my chest that always came with deep winter had eased. She also knew how to read the snow. One afternoon, she stepped outside for only a few minutes and returned with the knowledge that a deer had passed near the fence line during the night. She showed Neera the faint tracks before the fresh snow covered them again. Most surprising was the way she cooked. She made a simple flatbread from the coarse flour I kept, mixing it with a little fat and herbs she had gathered and dried herself. The first time she placed one on the table, still warm, Neera's eyes widened. The girl tore into it with both hands and, for the first time since they had arrived, laughed out loud when a piece broke and fell into her lap. The sound was small and startled, as if it had escaped without her permission. Melra's shoulders eased at the noise. I found myself staring at the half-empty cup of tea in my hands, no longer cold. The house began to change in ways I had not expected. There were now 3 bowls on the table instead of 1. The fire in the hearth was built higher in the evenings. Neera started leaving her small boots by the door without being asked. I no longer sat alone with the sound of the wind. On the 7th day, I rode into Greyford for salt and a few other supplies. The market was busy despite the cold. I kept my head down and spoke only when necessary. Still, I heard the voices. They were not loud, but they carried. "Edric's been burning more wood than usual. Someone saw smoke coming from his place every hour of the day. They say there's an orc woman living there now, a widow. And a child, green skin and all." I paid for the salt and left without answering. The ride back felt longer than it should have. By the time I reached the farm, the anger had settled into something heavier and quieter. Melra knew before I told her. She was standing at the window when I entered, Neera playing quietly near the fire. She turned at the sound of the door and studied my face for a moment. "You heard them," she said. I set the sack of salt on the table. "It does not matter what they say." "It will," she answered. "It always does." That evening, after Neera had fallen asleep on the bench, Melra moved through the south room with quiet purpose. She folded the few clothes she had brought, gathered the small bundle of herbs she had been drying, and placed everything near the door. I watched her from the kitchen without speaking. When she finally came to stand in the doorway, her face was calm but set. "We will leave in the morning," she said, "before the snow melts enough for people to come looking." I remained seated at the table. "The snow is still deep. You will not make it far. We have walked through worse." "You have a child who is still thin from hunger," I said, "and you are not yet strong enough to carry her if she falters." Melra did not answer immediately. She looked past me toward the dark window. "I will not be the reason your name is spoken with contempt in your own village." I stood then. I have lived long enough to know that other people's words do not keep a house warm, nor do they fill it. She held my gaze for a long moment. Something in her expression wavered, but she did not move to pick up the bundle she had prepared. That night the wind picked up again. I woke to the sound of small feet running across the floor. Neera appeared in the kitchen, eyes wide and wet, clutching the blanket around her shoulders. She did not call for her mother at first. She simply stood there, breathing hard, as if the dream still held her. Melra was already rising from the south room when I reached the hearth. She gathered Neera into her arms without question and sat with her on the bench. I added wood to the fire until the flames rose high and bright, then took one of the smaller lanterns from its hook and set it on the table near them. The light pushed the shadows back toward the corners. Neera pressed her face into her mother's shoulder. After a while, her breathing slowed. She lifted her head just enough to look at me across the small space. "Will you send us away?" she asked. Her voice was very small. I met her eyes. "No," I said. "No one is going out into the storm." She watched me a moment longer, as if weighing whether the words could be trusted. Then she nodded once and closed her eyes again, still pressed against Melra. I remained by the fire, feeding it slowly so the warmth would not fade. Melra did not speak, but she did not look toward the bundle she had left by the door either. When Nira's breathing had deepened into sleep, Melra carefully laid her back on the bench and covered her. She stayed kneeling beside the child for a long time, one hand resting lightly on the small back. I did not move. The only sounds were the settling of the logs and the soft tick of snow against the glass. After a while, Melra rose. She did not return to the south room. Instead, she sat on the opposite side of the hearth from me. For the first time since she had woken in this house, she did not keep the full length of the room between us. We did not speak. There was nothing that needed to be said yet. But when I rose later to check the fire, I noticed she had not moved away. She remained where she was, watching the flames, her shoulders no longer held quite as tightly as they had been. Outside, the wind continued to move through the trees. Inside, the house held 3 people instead of 1, and the silence between us had changed. It was no longer the silence of strangers sharing space. It was something quieter and heavier, and beginning to feel almost like belonging. The fever came on quickly. It began as a cough that would not settle, the kind that rattled in a small chest and refused to loosen no matter how much warm broth Melra coaxed into her. By evening, Nira's cheeks were flushed dark against her green skin, and her small body burned beneath the blankets. She tossed and turned on the bench, whimpering in her sleep. Melra knelt beside her, one hand pressed to the child's forehead, her own face tight with worry. I watched from the table, the firelight throwing long shadows across the room. "She needs rest and warmth," I said. "The fever will break by morning if we keep the fire high." Melra did not answer at once. She rose and went to the small bundle of dried herbs she kept on the shelf above the stove. Her fingers moved through the leaves and roots with quick, practiced care. When she reached the bottom of the bundle, she stopped. Her shoulders went still. "What is it?" I asked. She turned, holding a small cloth pouch in her hand. "I am missing the winter root. It is the only thing that will bring the fever down before it takes too much from her." "There will be none to find tonight," I said. "The snow is too deep, and the wind has risen again. We will go at first light." Melra looked at Nira, who had begun to shiver despite the heat radiating from her skin. She said nothing, but I saw the decision settle behind her eyes. I should have known then. I should have stayed awake and watched her more closely. Instead, I sat beside the bench, wiping Nira's forehead with a cool cloth and speaking low to her when she stirred, telling her the storm would pass and she would feel better soon. I did not notice when Melra slipped away. It was the cold that finally pulled me from the chair. The door to the south room stood open, and a thin line of snow had drifted across the floorboards. Her cloak was gone from the hook by the door. The smaller of the 2 baskets we used for gathering sat empty on the table. I knew at once where she had gone. I moved without thinking. I took every lantern from the wall and lit them with hands that shook from more than cold. One I left burning on the table so Nira would have light if she woke. The rest I carried outside, hanging 2 along the fence line and tying the brightest to the saddle of the horse. The wind tore at my coat and drove snow into my eyes, but I kept moving. I could not lose another person to the dark. Nira stirred when I returned for one last lantern. Her eyes were glassy with fever. "Stay by the fire," I told her. "I am going to bring your mother back." She tried to sit up. I pressed her gently down and tucked the blanket around her shoulders. "Do not leave this spot. I will not be long." I rode into the storm for the second time that winter. The snow had already begun to cover her tracks, but the wind had not yet erased them completely. I followed the faint line of footprints across the field and into the trees, the lantern swinging wildly from the saddle and from my hands. Twice I nearly lost the trail where the drifts had piled high. Twice I dismounted and searched on foot until I found the next mark. My chest ached with the cold and with something sharper. I found her near the frozen stream, collapsed against the base of a thick oak. Her cloak was dusted white, and one hand still clutched a small bundle of dark roots. Her lips had turned the color of bruised berries. When I knelt and touched her face, her skin was ice. "Melra," I said, though the wind swallowed the word. I lifted her as carefully as I could and carried her to the horse. She was heavier than I remembered, or perhaps I was weaker than I had been the first night. I tied her across the saddle the same way I had carried her from the cabin weeks earlier. then climbed up behind her and turned the horse toward the faint glow of the lanterns I had left burning along the fence. By the time we reached the house, my arms burned and my face had gone numb. I carried her inside and laid her on the bed in the south room. Nira was still awake, sitting upright on the bench with the lantern clutched in both hands. When she saw her mother, she made a small, broken sound. "She found what she went for," I said. "Now we must make her warm." I built the fire higher than I ever had before. I stripped the wet cloak from Malra and wrapped her in every blanket and quilt the house possessed. Then I sat on the floor beside the bed and held her hand between both of mine, rubbing warmth into her fingers while Nira watched from the doorway. Near dawn, the fever in Nira finally broke. She fell into a true sleep, her breathing easier, her skin cooler to the touch. Malra stirred not long after. Her eyes opened slowly. When she saw me sitting there, still holding her hand, something in her face changed. "You went after me," she whispered. "You should not have gone alone." I could not watch her burn. "I know." I looked down at our joined hands. "But the next time you need to save her, you will do it with me, not by disappearing into the storm." She was quiet for a long time. Snow tapped against the window. The fire popped and settled. "Why did you fear so much?" she asked at last. I had no answer ready. The words came before I could weigh them. "Because this house has been cold for too long," I said. "And from the moment you and your daughter crossed the threshold, I have not wanted it to be cold again." Malra's eyes filled. She did not turn away. 2 tears slipped down her cheeks, slow and silent. She reached up with her free hand and touched the side of my face, her fingers cold and trembling. I did not move. I did not speak. I simply stayed where I was, her hand in mine, while the first gray light of morning crept across the floor. When Nira woke later, she found us still there. She climbed onto the bed without a word and curled between us, one small hand resting on her mother's arm and the other reaching for mine. None of us spoke of leaving. None of us spoke of the village or the snow or the days that would come after. Outside, the storm had begun to ease. Inside, the lanterns I had lit still burned low on the table, their light steady and warm against the walls. For the first time since the night she had knocked, I allowed myself to believe that the house might not have to be empty again. The snow began to loosen its grip on the land. It did not happen all at once. For several days the air stayed sharp, but each morning the drifts along the fence line looked a little lower, and thin threads of water began to run from the roof edges. The road that had been buried for weeks slowly reappeared in patches of brown and gray. I watched it happen from the window while I split wood, and each time I saw more earth, I felt something heavy settle in my chest. Malra stood on the porch for a long time that afternoon. She did not speak. She simply looked toward the place where the path met the trees, her arms folded against the cold. Nira played near the barn with the old basket she used for eggs, her boots already wet from the melting snow. When Malra finally came back inside, she did not meet my eyes. That evening we sat across from each other at the table after Nira had gone to sleep in the south room. The fire had burned low. Only one lantern remained lit between us. Malra turned her cup slowly in her hands before she spoke. "The snow is melting." I nodded. "It is." She was quiet for a while, then she asked, "If I go, will you be sad?" I looked at her across the small circle of light. There was no point in lying now. "Yes." She set the cup down. Her fingers stayed on the rim as if she needed something to hold. "I gave my word," she said. "I said I would stay only until the snow was gone. I remember." Malra studied me for a long moment. "You could ask me to stay." "I will not keep you here with a debt," I answered. "You owe me nothing. If you leave because you choose to, not because you feel you must pay for shelter." She looked down at her hands. The fire crackled softly behind her. Before either of us could speak again, small footsteps sounded from the hallway. Nira appeared in her nightdress, rubbing one eye with the back of her hand. In her other hand, she carried the smallest lantern, the one I had given her on the night she first knocked. I had repaired its cracked frame and cleaned the glass so the flame would burn steady. She walked to the table and set the lantern down between us. Then she looked at her mother. "If we leave," she said, who will light the lamps for people who get lost?" Malra's breath caught. She reached out and touched Neera's hair, but she did not answer. Neera turned to me. Her yellow eyes were serious in the way only a child's can be when they have decided something matters. "You said the lights are for anyone who cannot find their way," she said. "If we go, there will be no one to keep them burning here." I did not know how to answer her. The words sat in my throat, too large and too simple at the same time. After Neera had been coaxed back to bed, I remained at the table. Melra had not moved. The lantern between us threw soft light across her face. I reached into the pocket of my coat and took out the small silver ring I had kept wrapped in cloth for 3 years. It had belonged to my mother. I placed it on the table and turned it once so the metal caught the light. "When your daughter knocked on my door," I said, "I thought I was only bringing a sick woman out of the cold. I did not know 2 people would walk into this house and make it feel too quiet when they were not here." Melra looked at the ring but did not touch it. "I am a widow," she said quietly. "I have a child. I am Orc. Those things will not change." "I know," I answered, "and I have looked at all of them and still want you to stay. Not as guests, not as people passing through until the next thaw. I want you to stay as my wife if you will have me." Her eyes lifted to mine. For a long time she said nothing. I could hear the soft drip of melting snow from the eaves outside. "I have run through too many winters," she said at last. Her voice was low and rough. "I have slept in too many places that were not mine. I do not want to run any more." She reached across the table and placed her hand over the ring, covering it with her palm. "I want to stop," she said. Neera must have been listening from the doorway. She came running before either of us could speak again and threw her arms around both of us at once, her small body warm and solid between our chairs. Melra laughed, a short, startled sound, and pulled the girl closer. I rested one hand on Neera's back and the other over Maelra's. Outside, the last of the snow continued to melt from the roof. Inside, the lantern I had lit still burned steadily on the table, its light reaching the walls of a house that no longer felt too large for the night. 3 knocks had brought them here. I had lit every lamp I owned to bring them home through the storm. Only later did I understand that the same light had also led me out of the long silence I had lived inside for 3 years. The farm at the edge of the oak fence was no longer the house of a man waiting for nothing. It had become a place where a child's laughter lived in the kitchen, where the smell of Orc flatbread sometimes rose from the hearth, and where the lanterns would keep burning for anyone who might one day knock in the dark, asking for help.